Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the MLA Sheep Productivity and Profitability webinar series. Tonight's webinar is focusing on lameness and prime lamb ewes and lambs, and managing, treating and preventing what is a very costly issue. Our presenter tonight is Paul Nilon of Nilon Farm Health. Next week we have a webinar with Bruce Allworth. It's going to be on the Thursday, and it's the topic that Bruce is dealing with is when and why you'd shear prime lambs. So Bruce is specifically going to be focusing on the issue around the response of lamb growth rate to shearing, and whether or not it's warranted, and if so, in what circumstances. So tonight, a bit like the sunrise weather presenter, I've been shipped off to an exotic location, and you're hearing from this webinar from the Darlington Point Caravan Park. So we've got good internet, and we've got a good cabin here to present from, and it's a good spot by the Murrumbidgee River. So we're looking forward to hosting you from here. So before we move on, most people here tonight are fairly familiar with the webinar platform, but just a quick reminder that you can open and collapse that control panel on the right hand screen using the red button there. So you can hear us, but obviously we can't hear you, and I encourage you to type in a few questions and comments into the questions box there, so that we know that you know where it is and that you can hear us. Log your questions there, and at the end of the webinar tonight I'll be going through them in chronological order, and Paul has kindly kindly offered to stay online for as long as we need to get your questions answered. So tonight's presenter is Mr. Paul Nilon. He's the owner of his business Nilon Farm Health. Paul's very well resourced to present tonight's webinar. He graduated in 1983 from the Sydney University, and then moved on and graduated from the McKinnon Project in Melbourne, 1986. So for the remaining years, apart from a year here or there, Paul has spent most of his career working with large animals in health, veterinary and consulting. For the last 12 years, Paul's operated his business out of Tasmania, and has a special interest in parasitology, nutrition, genetics, and general animal health programs for commercial beef and cattle producers. So we've got an excellent presenter with us tonight, and we're very lucky to have people of the experience of Paul and the knowledge of Paul presenting to our MLA Sheep Productivity and Profitability webinar audience. So with that, I'd like to welcome Paul to the webinar. Just give us 1 second there and we'll find Paul. Hi Paul, have you got us there?
I've got you. I haven't seen the thing to change over. There we go. How about that? And we hit that one. Are we in full screen?
Spot on, Paul. Thank you. Hear you soon.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David. Thank you for the introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're well. I hope you're enjoying a bit of a spring. We've got a fair so-so one here in northern Tassie, and I hope the fishing's better where you are than where it is here in Tassie at the moment. Now, before I launch into this, my wife points out to me that when I'm giving a presentation to a live audience, that I frequently close my eyes when I concentrate. So if you happen to notice that the screen goes blank, then I'll probably close my eyes and I'm concentrating, and it's worthwhile listening to. But if the screen doesn't at any stage go blank, then you must assume that what I'm talking is rubbish, because it doesn't take any concentration, and you may as well log off. So by necessity, we're dealing with a big subject in a very short period of time. So I thought that we would give at least reasonable detail on the two big lameness issues that we see in our prime lamb flocks. with a high rainfall bias, but I guess that's where most prime lamb flocks are anyway. That being foot abscess and foot rot. Then I'd briefly like to mention two other conditions which I think are underrated amongst the plethora of other things that can cause lameness. And then we'll have one or two concluding comments, and then it's back to David for some questions. So I guess this is fairly self-evident, but the effects of lameness, unless they are really, really severe, might be a bit of a sleeper. But there's little doubt that severe lameness will predispose the ewes to pregnancy toxemia and other metabolic conditions in late pregnancy. And, you know, even if you get them up and going, there's going to be an increased lamb loss from those ewes. But the ewe mortality, which I guess is something that we only understand pretty superficially, can go through the roof if you've got the combination of severe lameness plus pregnancy toxemia or other metabolic diseases. In addition to that, there's absolutely no doubt that ewes that are not grazing because they can't have really poor lactations with increased lamb losses, and certainly reduced weaning numbers and weaning weights. For the lambs, I guess it's a no-brainer, but the big issue there, in fact, is if they're lame, then your finishing times can go through the roof, and you have all of the variable costs associated with trying to get the lameness under control. Although we're not going to talk much about rams tonight, let's not forget that foot abscess in particular is a major cause of ram wastage. And if you're paying $1,000 plus for your prime lamb rams these days, which most people are, then the last thing you want them to do is to break down with a foot abscess after they've been on the place for 6 months. And again, I guess it's a no-brainer, but look, it's a major and very visible animal welfare problem. And there's a few things so intimidating as having the RSPCA or the animal welfare officer from the department knocking on your door because you've got ewes down with foot rot right on the point of lambing, or ewes unable to graze because they've got great big clubby feet with foot abscess. So please act quickly and diligently to make sure that those issues don't occur. Okay, so the first cab off the rank is foot abscess, and this photo shows pretty typically what we tend to see, and that is a pussy discharge between the claws and swelling, misshapen claw on our left as we look at the picture. It is a major cause of lameness across all flocks, if not the major cause. And as I've already said, it's a major cause of wastage in prime lamb rams. The causal bug is Fusobacterium necrophorum. The beauty of this little beast is that it's quite ubiquitous in the environment and in sheep flocks, so there's never any consideration of being able to eradicate it. And it can be aided by other bugs on occasions. And there is a sort of a long postulated tie-up between the foot rot bug and the foot abscess bug, but we won't go down that pathway tonight. So as we've seen from the previous photo, it's characterized by swelling usually on one digit, but it can be on more than one foot, obviously. A pussy discharge, most frequently between the toes, but it can be around the coronary gland or both. Now, one of the issues with this disease, which is poorly understood, is that if the cases are left untreated for anything more than a very short period of time, then in fact the bugs invade the joint capsule and erode the structures of the joint. And we're going to come back to that because it impacts on both the outcome and the need for a swift treatment. Whoops, there, we'll go back one. The predisposing factors, I'm sure you're all aware of them, but you know, heavy, late pregnant ewes, wet conditions which allow damage just through maceration and constant wetness between the toes, And the big killer is when you yard them for your pre-lambing operations, for vaccination and so forth, and you have one or two animals that contaminate a small area of ground quite heavily, and then within a few days you start to see many other cases. In rams, the predisposing causes are really poorly understood, but there are theories which suggest it's their hypersexuality in very small areas in the run-up to mating, but that's only really a speculative theory. There may also be some breed differences in susceptibility with the rams, but we won't go there for fear of being sued. It's pretty much an unknown condition in lambs. So what can we do to try and reduce the impact? Well, the first thing is to keep the weight off the crossbred ewes and try and keep them out of the paddocks that are likely to damage their feet, either through just rank wetness and or other things that can abrade the skin between the toes. I know that it's sort of quite glib of me to say keep the weight of crossbred ewes under control, but I think that in fact we in the veterinary profession, and I dare say people like David as well, are reassessing what condition score our crossbred ewes should be in at lambing, because even without rank foot disease, we're starting to see a whole host of issues because many of our crossbred ewes are run in excess condition. So if you try and get your adult crossbred ewes lamb down at around about condition score 3, then you're certainly going to be reducing the risk of foot disease, foot abscess, and other metabolic diseases as well. Now, I urge all of my clients to have a foot bath in place, not to combat foot rot if they haven't got it, but purely and simply for good foot hygiene when the ewes are yarded for the pre-lambing treatments. So it's not 100% foolproof, but a simple 10% walkthrough in zinc sulfate is, tends to keep the lid on the bug's capacity to spread to lots of different animals. The really important thing, in fact, is to try and identify and promptly treat all clinical cases. And really the only treatment that brings you any joy is antibiotics, and the one that we would recommend is oxytetracycline. So that's sold as Alamycin or Terramycin LA or something like that. Now, the reason for the emphasis on the prompt is that if you leave them untreated for any length of time, then what happens is, in fact, that the bugs invade the joint capsule and the antibiotics will get rid of the infection, but you're left with permanently disfigured and dysfunctional joints, and so the animals are never going to get better. So, we recommend 2 shots of antibiotics, but if that doesn't cure the case, then you've really got to make a decision on whether the animal is well enough to get through the lambing, and then look at culling it at the end of the season. Now, the beware of the QA obligation is purely and simply that here in Tasmania, and I presume in many other places, the QA schemes that various bodies are signing you up to are increasingly tetchy about using antibiotics on any more than a few animals. So just sort of see what your obligations are under the QA scheme and then go ahead and treat anyway. This last point I'd like to make is that every so often, and it seems to go in about 5-year cycles, iodine and zinc and vitamin E supplements are proffered by various people as being good preventives. There is, to the best of my knowledge, no published evidence that they make a scrap of difference. But if you've got a tax problem that needs solving, then there's nothing like hyper-supplementation with unnecessary things. And, in some cases, if you live in iodine deficient areas, then you may possibly you may possibly increase your lambing percentage by combating the iodine deficiency. But there's not much information to suggest that any of those things make a scrap of difference to solving your foot abscess problems. Okay, so this picture here, a bit of a break from the talking. This picture here has been pilfered from our New Zealand colleagues, Dave West and company. And you can see that it's an X-ray, and the toe on our right, the final bone, the distal phalanx, is completely dislocated. And if you have any background in radiography, you'd also know that those joint surfaces are pretty badly eroded. So that's what happens if you don't get in and treat them really promptly, and by really promptly, you know, within 2 or 3 days. The other comment I'd make about the treatment is that when you catch them in the paddock to give them the antibiotics, then something as simple as snipping the point off the toe may help, because a percentage of these, in fact, are just good old-fashioned toe abscess, and if you release the pressure through the point of the toe, then you've got instant cure. But the vast majority of them are, in fact, this deep-seated tissue and joint infection. So treat them early and treat them vigorously. Variation on a theme. On this one, the pus is discharging through the coronary band. I'm sure you've all seen it. It doesn't make it any easier to look at. Okay, so that's the 5 or 10 minute version of foot abscess. So we'll move on to foot rot. And in talking about foot rot, I'm aware, in fact, that the prevalence is very low in particularly, I guess, New South Wales and Western Australia, perhaps as a result of regulatory programs. It may not be as low as some of the state authorities suggest, but that's a discussion for another day. Foot rot is a highly contagious disease of sheep and goats caused by Dichelobacter nodosus, is the current name for the bug. The reason that I've put cattle in there, in fact, is that they are capable of transmitting and maintaining the more benign strains and perhaps the intermediate strains. So if you think you've got a clean flock, but every so often you have this this issue of a low-grade interdigital sort of infection popping up, then it's just possible that the cattle are the cause. But the cattle are not capable of carrying and maintaining the really highly virulent strains. So it's pretty prevalent in Victoria and Tasmania. In Tasmania, we expect something like about 30 to 40% of flocks have virulent foot rot. And it is a real impediment to our industry. And for a whole host of reasons, movement towards eradication has been much slower than in other states. It's mostly a problem in the high rainfall zone, but be aware that it can hide in flocks in places like the Riverina for quite some years if they have a series of dry years. So if you import sheep from those areas, it's pretty important that you keep it in the back of your mind that not every flock there is going to be free of foot rot. It spreads during the warm, wet conditions. So the ideal time for transmission is mostly in the spring, and then some places get a second go in the autumn. And of course, the issue is that given that most of us, I guess, are spring lambing flocks, then in fact, our options to treat and control during the time of maximum transmission are seriously limited. So here we have a absolutely ripping case of foot rot. That's what we would describe as a score 5 lesion, where both of those claws have been completely underrun across the sole and up the walls as well. So essentially that animal couldn't bear any weight on that foot at all, and it's not uncommon to have more than one foot infected at any one time. So that's the nasty end of the spectrum. But in reality, there's a continuum from mild interdigital lesions that may affect a large proportion of the flock, but don't actually cause any underrun of the horn of the sole to the sort of stuff that was shown in that last slide. And how much damage the foot rot does depends on the inherent virulence of the strain of foot rot that you've got on the place, the genotype of the sheep, and the seasonal suitability. So, you know, if you get a really warm, wet spring, then it goes like the clappers, and it can end up like we saw in that previous photo. So, although it may not be worth your while to launch a eradication campaign against mild strains, be aware that even mild strains can put a significant tail on a mob. And in the case of lambs, because lambs are actually more prone to sort of the effects of the infection, it can slow your finishing times, you know, quite considerably. So just because it's not looking like that slide a couple of minutes back doesn't mean that it's not an issue that requires attention. Okay, so if you are in the fortunate position of not having foot rot, make sure you keep it out. So for our clients here that don't have foot rot, we've got lots that have got double fencing, and we've got biosecurity things in place to try and reduce the risk. The first cab off the rank in this, in fact, is to do your due diligence and specifically ask for a sheep health statement. If there's any doubt about it, then before you buy sheep, inspect them. You know, I mean, I think you're entitled to do that, and seek some help from a vet or an epidemiologist on the numbers that you need to inspect. It's important to footbath off the transport, and preferably, if you in any way can, put them into a wetter paddock for a quarantine period and just see what happens. So, you know, a quarantine period will not tell you much if it's as dry as the Gobi Desert, but if you've got a moderately wet paddock, it's surprising what pops up in you know, a short period of time, and then you can make some decisions about whether you keep those animals or trade them on if you're allowed to. And it goes without saying that if you are foot rot free, then ramp up your boundary security to the point of paranoia, because of all the diseases that you want to keep out, foot rot's the one that's the most important, particularly here in Tassie and Victoria, where we've all got Johne's disease and we're all vaccinating for it, but we can really do without foot rot. And as we've already said, just be aware that sheep from dry areas may actually harbour the bug, and it only breaks out sporadically just because the seasonal conditions in the area that they came from are not conducive to it being all that evident. I don't know that that applies to Tibooburra, David, but certainly the Riverina and the Monero and some areas north of the range in Victoria where foot rot can sleep for quite some time. Okay, so when we talk about control, obviously we're assuming that you've got some level of infection with a bug of virulence unknown. It can be sort of just a mild interdigital strain or something that can cause full blown foot rot. But the aim is to try and get the prevalence down at times of low transmission. So for most of the high rainfall areas, that's going to be over the summer period. In really dry winters, it can be the early part of winter as well. And then you've got to try and keep it low for those times when you can't handle the sheep all that easily. The first comment I'd make is that pairing seems to feature in everybody's foot rot control program, and in fact it does not add all that much to the treatment spectrum. So we recommend that it's only used for diagnostic purposes once you enter an eradication program. Pairing to increase the efficacy of your foot bathing solutions is really pretty problematic. You're better off sort of spending your money on fine scotch and going and having a good time. Foot bathing is the standby for trying to reduce the prevalence, and there are a range of registered products. Zinc sulfate plus or minus. Oops, there. I think I can't see what it's disappeared off the side. So zinc sulfate. I'm sorry, plus or minus sodium lauryl sulfate. The difference is that if you add the sodium lauryl sulfate, you might get a sort of improved therapeutic effect if you've got a foot bath big enough to soak them for a period of time. There's a zinc and copper sulfate and copper nitrate product called Radicate, and that has all sorts of registered claims, but I'd sort of say that it's not an absolute revolution. A host of home remedies, most of them are things like organic acids. For example, here in Tassie, we've got a guy that is trying to get a vinegar-based product off the ground. And the last one I'd mention is formalin, which in fact is very, very efficacious, but really hard to recommend on OHS grounds. So unless you've got sort of a smoking habit that you can't break and you're trying to get an intermediate stage, stay away from the formalin. The single most important thing is the frequency of foot bathing. So particularly during times when there is active transmission, then if you are able to foot bath on a weekly basis as a walkthrough, medium to long term, that is going to have a much greater therapeutic effect than sort of doing them once a month or less frequently. And that's pretty much regardless of what compound you are using. So we recommend to clients that they set up, simple solutions like, foot bathing between paddocks, which can be done pretty easily. You can send the kids out after school and they can do a few mobs, and it works reasonably well. Other clients down here have done all sorts of, put a lot of effort into things, like building really quite substantial portable foot baths that run around on trailers, and they still do it out in the paddock, but it's a bit like a military operation. Just keep in mind that foot bathing is not a route to eradication. In fact, none of the treatments are. So we won't be dealing with eradication tonight because that's a whole day subject in itself. But foot bathing at the very best keeps the prevalence down, but it certainly does not lead to eradication unless you're extremely lucky and you've only got 3 sheep. It's important that we mention vaccines. Now, the old multi-strain vaccine, which was marketed by Coopers, has been off the market now for about 7 years, unfortunately. We do have a bivalent vaccine available, and that means 2 strains at once. And this vaccine is really potent and very long-acting, much more potent and long-acting than the old 10 strain. The trouble is that, in fact, many people have more than 2 strains of the footrot bacterium in their flock. And to use this vaccine, first of all, you've got to culture the bugs or go for a direct serotyping technique. And then you hope like heaven that you've got no more than 2 strains of at least the virulent strains of the bugs. If that is the case, then the bivalent vaccine offers a lot of hope for very good control, high cure rates, and also it sets the stage for eradication if that's the way that you think you can go. So we're doing a deal of work with that, trying to find places where it might work. And we've had some successes, and we've had also lots of disappointments where people come back with 4 or 5 or 6 different strains. And in that situation, using the limited valency vaccine becomes really difficult. I'd also point out that at this point in time, vaccine use is not permitted in New South Wales and WA. And I think that might be a little bit short-sighted, but that's not for me to decide. Okay, the last thing I'd like to mention in terms of foot rot control is antibiotics. Now, mostly antibiotics are used as a really good, fast and effective way to reduce the prevalence of active infection before you go into an eradication campaign. But we have also used it on many occasions where people are facing a disaster. So in fact, they've got a high prevalence, 30–40% of deep-seated lesions. It's midwinter, it's wet, and you know, it looks like things could go really haywire. So we have used antibiotics in that situation to prevent the disaster, and it works absolutely magnificently. You might well ask how somebody could have sort of 40% score 4–5 lesions and not know about it. Well, I don't know, but it does seem to happen. So if you find yourself in that situation, then consider doing a whole or a part flock treatment with antibiotics. Again, oxytetracycline is the drug of choice. And by all means, consult your QA scheme, but on animal welfare terms and overall salvageability, then you've probably got few options but to use the antibiotics. So I think we might have lost a footrot slide or two. That's a bit of a pity. Okay, so we won't talk any more about foot rot. Anybody who wants to look at eradication programs, the best publication at the moment is the one that has been produced by Sheep Connect in Tasmania, and it's available on the Sheep Connect Tasmania website, and it's good bedtime reading for everybody else as well. Okay, so why would we be putting up a slide of a ewe with a scabby mouth infected teat when we're talking about lameness? Well, we primarily see scabby mouth as a problem in lambs because the ewes are already immune, either because they've been scratched or because they've been exposed already. But every so often we do see it as a problem in pre-weaning lambs, and frequently the story starts with sort of scabby teats like that. And so if scabby teats get into the lambs, then the lambs will have lesions on their lips and sometimes down their throat, and those animals contaminate the ground, and then after that you can also pick up foot infections as well. Having said all that, it's mostly a post-weaning problem, and in this neck of the woods we tend to see it in the autumn. Whether it's affecting the lips primarily or causing lameness or both, it can easily add 4 to 6 weeks to your finishing time. And because it's such a prepident sort of infection, then it's not uncommon to have infection rates of 50 or 60 or even 70% of lambs. And so it's not just sort of a few slow finishes. The whole lot of them can be put right behind the 8 ball. It's an episodic disease on most places. So my experience has been that there are very few places that don't experience it at least occasionally. But the severity and the extent to which it spreads through the flock depend on a whole host of factors, most of which are pretty poorly understood. So you can seek advice on whether to scratch at lamb marking. I'm pretty much inclined to say that it's a very worthwhile preventive for most of our producers here in Tasmania and other areas in the high rainfall zone. Your experience in other parts of the country may dictate differently. Vaccination in the face of an outbreak is not recommended because by the time the vaccine starts to kick in, then in fact the vast majority of animals have either become infected or have developed immunity from an inapparent infection. So with few exceptions, if you've got the problem confronting you, then scratching doesn't do a whole lot. So really you're left to let it run its course and rue the day that you didn't scratch. But that's not necessarily a reason to scratch. If you only see a very low prevalence every few years, then it's probably not worthwhile. But if you see episodes every 3 or 4 years of high prevalence, then really consider putting scratching into your animal health program. In all except the most unusual circumstances, and that is where they get an infection down their throats pre-weaning from infected teats. It's rarely worthwhile to treat them with antibiotics or give them any other ancillary treatments. Okay, so the last cab off the rank tonight is this combined syndrome of rickets and osteoporosis. Now, they're really separate diseases, and the pathologists go to great length and bore us to grog talking about what those differences are. But they do overlap quite a deal, and they do have common determinants. So rickets is primarily a deficiency in vitamin D. So it occurs sort of south of the range in Victoria and all through Tassie, and perhaps even in that southeast corner of South Australia, right at the end of winter. So here in Tassie, because we're spring lambers, it's mostly 1-year-old lambs on grass dominant or cereal type pastures. In other parts of the world, if you're an autumn lammer, then you may well see it at the end of winter in lambs that are sort of 4 or 5 months of old age, just after they've been weaned. Osteoporosis is a much more complex disease, and it tends to result from long-term calcium undernutrition. But as we've already said, there is a deal of overlap between the two conditions. Now, the big surprise this year is that we saw rickets in a mob of 1-year-old ewes coming up to lamb, and they had been on cereals all through the winter. So in fact, in most cases, we see it in late finishing lambs, but these darlings were actually pregnant, and it presented a real animal health and animal welfare nightmare. So what do we see? Well, we see a multi-limb lameness with generalized ill thrift. So not only are they lame, but they look pretty manky as well. So manky, of course, is a scientific term that describes poor performing livestock. They walk around like half-open pocket knives. Now, many producers in Tasmania are acutely aware of this disease, and so it's pretty common to get called out to lame flocks at the end of winter, people saying they've got rickets, and they haven't got rickets at all. They've got some level of foot rot. But it is important that you get a diagnosis, not only to make sure you treat them correctly, but just to make sure that you're not on the verge of a major outbreak of foot rot. In my experience, they respond fairly well to a vitamin D injection, plus some form of calcium supplementation. It doesn't need to be, you know, the most expensive thing with every other mineral known to man and beast in it. Simple things like limestone and salt, or limestone in molasses, work very well. And a change to a more varied diet. And it's quite surprising how quickly the vast majority of these animals get up and going. Not all, I mean, some of them are left with permanently deformed limbs, but nonetheless, most of them get going. And it's a disease that we can, I think, pretty much predict most years. So in fact, if you're going to run your sheep on grass dominant or grass monocultures or cereals all through the winter, then those sheep are going to be, those young sheep at least, are going to be at high risk of rickets as the winter goes on. So to prevent that, that should be prevent, not treat. Give them a shot of vitamin D in the early winter and make sure that they've got calcium supplements at least while ever they're on those lush grass dominant pastures or on cereals. Okay, so here's a relatively young lamb with rickets, and you can see the big puffy joints in the knees there on the front leg, and we can just about convince ourselves that there's a bit of bowing in the legs, and we can tell that the sheep farmer is a Kiwi because in fact he's got the gumboots on. Here are a couple of rising 1-year-old sheep at the McKinnon project in 1986, and in fact, if we look hard enough, apart from the fact that they look pretty ill thrifty, we can see some turning out of the legs on the front legs of this animal here. And there are about 2,000 sheep in that particular mob that looked something like that. At least they're not daggy. Okay, so this is actually not rickets, which is more of a joint infection. This is an example of osteoporosis, which is in fact a longer term calcium deficiency issue as opposed to a lack of sunlight. So the bone on the left there is a good well-formed bone, and the bone on the right is completely eaten away or been resorbed to provide calcium for the circulation. So we would expect that animal to be running on the verge of calcium deficiency the whole time. And they also sort of have things like spontaneous fractures and shifting lameness and just general ill thrift as well. Okay, so what's it all mean? Well, I hope it's a no-brainer, I think, to understand that lameness really has the potential to knock the gloss off any prime lamb enterprise, and that's whether it's infecting the ewes, the lambs, or both. And just keep in mind the value of the rams and make sure that you keep them up and on their feet as well. The critical thing is that prevention is always better than cure, and that particularly applies to foot rot, but you need to put in place the preventive measures where you can to stop lameness spreading or developing, depending on what the cause is, and then when you do find it, treat it aggressively so that you don't have your ewes going down with metabolic disease and then not lactating and losing the lamb, and so that your lambs are finished in a timely fashion. And finally, remember the animal welfare aspects. They're looking over the fence all the time, and the last thing anybody wants in their day is a visit from the animal welfare officer. So thank you, David. Back to you, and we'll see if we can field a few questions.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was an excellent presentation, very clear and concise, and very informative. So thank you for that. And I'll just give you a rest for a little bit, Phil, if you, Paul, while I address some other aspects, and you can take the chance to grab a drink there. So it's been a great webinar, and I expect there'll be a few people in the audience that may need to move on to other things, and you're more than welcome to do so. Just before you head off, I'd like to just three quick things. And number one is that don't forget we have an excellent webinar planned for next Thursday with Bruce Allworth on the shearing of lambs for increased growth rate. Should we, and if so, when? We're also got a webinar, post-webinar survey that's going to pop up. So we do take notice of everyone's comments and scores. They provide the webinar on that. It helps us with the future planning and topic and presenter selection. And finally, it's been something that I've been meaning to make everyone aware of, and that you're actually able to watch these webinars from your smartphone. So if you go to your app store on your smartphone, wherever that may be, and you just type in "Go to Webinar," you'll have the opportunity to download the app, and when it comes webinar time, you can either open the webinar on the app from your phone, or if you dial in the webinar passcode or identification number, you can watch it wherever you are, or plug it into your earphones when you're driving the tractor or on the road, and listen in at least. And if you need to catch up on some of the visuals, then you're more than welcome to do that later. So there's a few good questions coming through here, Paul. Now I might take the liberty of leading with a question, if that's okay.
By all means.
So Paul, two quick questions from my side of things. Number one is, if I have a paddock and I remove foot rot positive sheep from that paddock, how long does it take for the paddock to come to be free of the bacteria? And the second part of the question is, I have sheep that are infected with the bacteria, but say they are in a very dry pasture environment, will those sheep carry the bacteria forever, or if they don't get to express it after a certain period of time, does it just eventually die away?
Okay. We'll start with the easy one first, which was the first half. I don't think anybody's ever demonstrated survival on pasture for more than 4 days. So because everything to do with foot rot should involve a high degree of paranoia, we say 7 days is the quarantine paddock before you've got a clean pasture. And yeah, I think that's pretty much universally regarded as being a good, safe buffer. Okay. Now the second question is way more complicated. I think that the short answer is to say that in dry conditions, the disease can become inapparent to the point where you believe that it has sort of completely died out of the flock, or where you just stop looking. So we presume, in fact, that in those situations that there is an ongoing low level of transmission and circulation of the disease in the flock, and it's that ongoing transmission, whether it's around watering points or, you know, maybe just small seasonal breaks. It may not come to your attention that there's an issue there, but it's enough to sustain the infection. And so when the sheep are moved from the Riverina into the New England, or, you know, the Southern Tablelands, or somewhere where they have long, reliable springs, then it'll get a go on. So I guess the point is that I'm not aware of any work that shows that foot rot dies out naturally in a flock that's known to be infected. It may, but I think it's pretty unlikely. It's just that the prevalence and the virulence of that infection is inapparent to the everyday operator.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. That clears that up for me. Now I've got some even better questions from the audience. There's a question here from Ross. Ross asks of you, Paul, he noticed that you mentioned the footpath directly off transport. However, Ross was told recently that this may not be best practice, as it doesn't guarantee complete control of foot rot, and it actually may mask an outbreak, and it would be better just to quarantine and monitor closely that mob. What are your comments there, Paul?
The comment is that respectfully, I can't agree. I mean, for starters, in a lot of situations, you may not have a quarantine facility in which it's likely to express itself. The second issue is that although direct transmission, so you know, you bring infected sheep onto the place, or you have neighbours' stray sheep or goats come onto the place, is the primary route of transmission. There's very little doubt that dirty transports are a sufficient vehicle for transmission. So in fact, clean sheep may have gone on, and dirty sheep will come off. And if in fact you footbath them off the trucks, then there is a really good chance that you will stop that problem developing. And the final comment would be that if you have really good quarantine facilities and you've got any sort of deep-seated lesions in the sheep that you've brought onto the place, then it is highly unlikely that the foot bathing will mask it for so long that it becomes impossible to detect. So primarily based on the fact that the transports can be a source of infection, and although we would like to demand of our transports that they be squeaky clean all the time, the fact is that they're not. And so unless you've got real confidence in your transporter, then I'd still be foot bathing them off the truck.
Great, thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Ross.
No worries. Now, a quick question from Barbara. She just said, you know, Condy's crystals. Have you heard of that as a potential cure?
Yes. Look, the comment is that there are any number of solutions that will work, and we would expect them to work. And the reality is that most of them are not registered, and because they haven't done developmental work, we've only got a pretty poor idea, in fact, of what their efficacy at a flock level is going to be. But the additional comment is that things like Condy's crystal and organic acids, so things like vinegar and propionic acid and those sort of things, I mean, we just know from general dermatology that those things are going to provide surface disinfection. But in reality, do you have an easy, cost-effective way of treating large numbers of animals in it with it? So, yep, if you're using something like that, go for it. But really, zinc sulfate, Radicate, and zinc and sodium lauryl sulfate are registered products with known efficacy and known parameters in which you have to top up your foot bath and all of those sort of things, and they're ideal for mass medication, or mass treatment, I'm sorry.
Perfect, thanks, Paul. Just like to encourage everyone to pop a few questions in for Paul. It's not often we have someone with this level of experience and knowledge on these topics as we do here tonight. So make use of the opportunity, and I'm sure Paul's will stick around as long as we need to answer those questions. I've just got a quick one for you, Paul. That hoof that you showed, what you called, I think, a grade 5 infection, foot rot,
Yep.
It looked looked like the core of the hoof was fairly disintegrated, almost jelly-like. Does that foot,
Yes.
Would it come good? Like, if it was cured, would that foot be deformed, or is it not
It may well be deformed. It may well be deformed, but the deformation is deformation, as opposed to being sued, is more likely to occur, because there's ongoing infection there. So, when it comes to treating animals like that, particularly with antibiotics, and particularly if you're going to enter into a culling program, intuitively you would say that an animal like that will never come good. But on an individual foot basis or an individual sheep basis, it's very hard to tell whether that animal will respond to treatment or not. So, what we tend to see is that animals with quite mild lesions don't respond to aggressive treatments, whether that be foot bathing or antibiotics. And in other cases, animals whose feet are absolutely hanging off them respond absolutely brilliantly to antibiotics. So you may decide to cull that sheep because its 2 condition scores lighter than everything else. But if you decide that you're going to do a whole flock treatment or just treat every infected animal on the place, there's no reason to specifically cull that one just because it's a particularly nasty case.
Okay, well, thank you for that.
I don't think that answered the question. What was the question again?
Oh, look, I think it did. Don't worry, it did, Paul.
Yeah.
But we've got even better ones coming up here. We've got one from Ross. Ross asks, and now you might have to help me with the terminology. My scientific pronunciation's not the best, but Ross asks, what about chlamydial polyarthritis? Chlamydial, maybe.
Chlamydial polyarthritis. Yeah. Okay.
He has a little bit more in the question here. We have occasional outbreaks in central New South Wales. It seems as though the lambs become very lame and lose a lot of weight, but quickly recover after a week or 2.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So polyarthritis, translated, just means joint infection or multiple joint infections. We've got 3 major causes. One of them is a bug called erysipelas, which we can vaccinate against. And you actually vaccinate the ewes because the infection mostly transmits at lamb marking. And then the other 2 are what we call the pyogenic bacteria, and they tend to be contracted at birth. and the damage that they cause is pretty much irredeemable unless you treat them with antibiotics very early on. And then there's this wonderful thing, chlamydial polyarthritis, and it's transmissible from animal to animal. And exactly as Ross described, they get these big puffy joints, and then it knocks a couple of weeks growth out of them, and then a few weeks later it's all gone. Look, polyarthritis is a bit of a sleeper because you know, the information that's been collected by the sheep health monitoring program, you know, suggests that the abattoir condems are probably higher than most producers realise, but they're only going to realise it if they're getting feedback from their slaughterhouse, which is what happens at least one place here in Tassie. So that's fantastic. In terms of what you can do about the chlamydial polyarthritis, really not much, and it's a disease about which we know precious little. Suffice to say that it is probably not the same strain of chlamydia that causes abortion in other parts of the world, and occasionally can also cause conjunctivitis here. So if you had animals that were not responding or spontaneously, just with rest, then the suggestion is that you you treat them with antibiotics, but obviously identify them, because there's a good chance that some of those are going to be other bugs apart from chlamydia. With the erysipelas, then, as I said, we do have the vaccine available. It's called Erivac, and I think there might actually be another one as well. I sort of rarely, if ever, recommend it because, in fact, most of the time when we've investigated places with arthritis problems, we haven't found erysipelas. But if you do have a high prevalence of any of those forms of polyarthritis, then it's certainly worthwhile getting them investigated to see whether it is erysipelas or whether it's something that you might just have to live with. Other things that you can do for all that will limit all forms of arthritis, I guess, are good lambing paddock hygiene, and particularly good lamb marking hygiene, and that is the other way to try and keep erysipelas under control. Yeah, so again, I'm sorry, that's a long-winded answer. I hope it's satisfied Ross's question.
Thank you, Paul. Ross has actually got another quick one here.
Ross has got a lot of lameness problems.
No, oh well, he's got a lot of good questions. He asks, sheep
that's good
with black feet less likely to get foot rot and foot abscess?
In effect, no. Okay, so having said that so definitively, we'll deal with the foot rot first. There's no doubt that some of the strains of sheep that have black feet are probably inherently more robust to foot rot infection than white-footed sheep, but we have seen sheep strains, including black-footed sheep, that are supposed to be highly resistant to foot rot. You know, they're sort of Romney derivatives and Corriedale derivatives. And believe me, if you've got the right strain of foot rot and the right strain of condition, it will wreak an absolute path of destruction. So the short answer to that is no. And with regard to foot abscess, I would suggest, in fact, that some of the breeds that I'm worried about have black feet, and they seem to be extremely prone to foot abscess. So the answer to both questions is no.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Question here from Ken. Ken asks, does foot bathing help abscess, and is there such thing as scald, i.e. wet infection between the toes? And Ken also thanks you for the great information.
Okay, well, thank you for your kind feedback, Ken. So let's, does foot abscess, I presume Ken means that does foot abscess actually reduce the effects of, does foot bathing reduce the effects of foot bathing once they're infected? And the short answer is no, because it's a deep-seated infection. As we saw from that X-ray, you can see the damage that it's done and the swelling of the soft tissues around. So it's a deep-seated infection. What foot bathing does in relation to foot abscess is that it gives you surface disinfection, and so in fact animals that are exposed to the bug are less likely to have it penetrate and set up the deep-seated infection. And I'm surmising, I've got no information to back this up, but I'm surmising also that if you've got animals that are discharging bugs, if you run them through the foot bath with the rest of the mob, then there's a very good chance, in fact, that the rate at which they sort of contaminate the ground might be diminished, at least for a short time. So it's certainly not a cure. The only cure that we have, in fact, is antibiotics. With regard to the second question, is there such a thing as scald, or what is scald? So my approach to answering that is to say that scald refers to what you see when you open up the toes. Okay, so if you've got inflammation and damage between the toes, then that counts as scald. So then the question becomes, well, what causes it? So it can be anything from chronic wet condition, if you've got sheep that prefer dry country, like you know, Dernies and Sams, and even Saxon Merinos for that matter. It can be a range of bacteria, including the bug that causes foot abscess, and a host of other bugs as well. But when all's said and done, if you have a high prevalence of animals that have inflammation between the toes, and that it appears to have spread from animal to animal, then there's a very good chance that you've got the foot rot bacterium involved. So that's the Dichelobacter nodosus infection. Now, it doesn't mean that it is sort of full-blown virulent foot rot. It might be one of the more benign strains, which only causes the interdigital or the scalding lesions. But you can't presume that that is the case. So if you don't ever see scald and then all of a sudden you're seeing it, pretty much regardless of what the season is like, it's worth having it investigated just to make sure that you haven't got a case of virulent foot rot. Does that answer the question? Again, I'm getting too long-winded.
No, that's fine, Paul. Thank you. So my interpretation of that is scald is how it's manifested.
Yes.
It is not in itself is not it's not a disease or a particular bacteria.
It's not a determinative cause. So it's not a you know, this bug causes scald and this other bug causes foot rot.
Yes. Okay.
It's what you see.
Awesome. Thank you.
And don't be sort of be persuaded by somebody to buy sheep just because they've got a little bit of scald, because it might be something much more sinister.
Yeah, it could be the start of something else. Now, there's a question here from Scott. I think it's a good question. Scott asks, when foot bathing, do you suggest to treat sheep for, say, weekly by running them through the foot bath, or maybe monthly, but allowing them to stand in the water for 10 or 15 minutes?
Okay. Look, it depends on your infrastructure, including your labour, and what you're seeing on the ground. So, in most situations, we would prefer a weekly sort of walkthrough. Like this, we're assuming that you're in conditions where transmission's occurring. So, as opposed to sort of, you know, a dry autumn where you might only need to foot bath irregularly when you get a prevalence of a few percent visibly lame animals. So, in most situations, in my experience, then the frequency of foot bathing is the critical thing. So I would, without knowing your place, Scott, say that the weekly foot bathing is the better option. If for sort of considerations of the size of the place or labour or the fact that you've just spent your superannuation on building the biggest foot bath in the world, it's easier to footbath them less frequently, then you can do that. And generally speaking, we would say go from straight zinc sulfate, which is all you need to for a walk-through foot bath, to using zinc sulfate and sodium lauryl sulfate. But to get the full benefit of the zinc and the sodium lauryl sulfate, you really need to be sort of foot bathing them for, quite some time. So the stock standard recommendation was half an hour, and people do everything from sort of 15. I'm sorry, the stock standard recommendation was an hour, but people do everything from sort of 15 minutes to an hour. So the longer the better, but you will benefit from the addition of the sodium lauryl sulfate, or alternatively going over to the proprietary product Radicate.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Paul, Barbara Ellis, she thanks you. She asked a question earlier, and she thanks you very much for the informative session. So a bit of positive feedback there. Quick question here from Rob Allen. Rob's from up at Temora there. He asks quickly, do zinc supplements have any positive effect on hoof health?
In my experience, no. So in this part of the world, they do the rounds every few years. The only conditions that I'm aware of where there are zinc responsive foot things are in cattle, not in sheep. And I've never seen any demonstrable benefit from zinc or iodine supplementation.
Yeah, okay, well, thank you. Question here from Craig. What percent zinc sulfate should be to water in a foot bath?
Okay, if you're just using it as a walkthrough, then 10 to 12%. So that's basically one bag of 25 kilograms of zinc sulfate heptahydrate. So if the man at the animal health store tries to sell you stuff that looks like blue crystals, then steer clear of it, because that's usually the monohydrate, and you won't ever be able to dissolve it. So zinc sulfate heptahydrate, one bag to every 200 liters of water, and then you can top that up by using a hydrometer that you can also get at the same store. Now, if you are going to add the sodium lauryl sulfate and soak them in it for any length of time, then you need to have 2% sodium lauryl sulfate and a 15 to 20% zinc sulfate. So the best benefit from the long soaking in the foot bathing solution requires an increase in the concentration.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you. That's really good. A quick comment here from Tim. Tim just said, he feels that chlamydial arthritis is a common problem, but we've got a question here from Jim. Jim asks, is zinc sulfate combined with sodium lauryl commercially available? And if so, what is the name of the product and where from?
Isn't that a good question? Look, at the moment, in fact, and I've been caught out by this, but at the moment I don't think there is. So in fact, you've got to source your zinc sulfate and your sodium lauryl sulfate and mix them together.
Okay.
But there's no, there used to be footrot, and it's no longer marketed.
Okay. Jim went on to ask about the cost of that product, but if we don't know if there's a product for Jim, we might just have to skip past that.
Yeah. Well, we can sort of talk about it in general terms. So if you're going for straight zinc sulfate, then the cost for footbathing is usually put at sort of 3 to 5 cents per trip through the bath. I mean, who exactly calculated that, I'm not quite sure. If, on the other hand, you're going for the higher concentration with the sodium lauryl sulfate, then the sort of ballpark figure is probably 20 to 25 cents.
Right, yeah, perfect, thank you. Quick question here. I think we've been over this, but we can maybe just nail it one more time, knock it on the head. What is foot scald, and is it a cause of lameness in ewes and lambs in the spring?
the answer is that foot scald is a description of what you see between the toes. So without repeating all of what we said before, it can be caused by mechanical factors, wet grass, and then a range of bacteria. But if in fact you've got a high prevalence, and particularly if you can see that inflammation between the toes heading towards the junction of the heel and the skin between the toes, then there's a very good chance that it also involves the foot rot bug. And so the foot rot bug may not be a virulent strain. It may be, pretty benign, and it never creates disease beyond the scalding strain. But you can't make that assumption without some investigation. So any sheep that have got scald are sheep that should be treated circumspectly. And certainly, every spring we see scald on pastures of all sorts. I mean, people used to talk about clover scald as a separate issue. Whether clover's got some magic property to irritate them, I don't know. But if you're not in the habit of seeing it, then get it investigated. And if you are in the habit of seeing it, get it investigated to make sure that you're not dealing with something that you've turned a blind eye to.
Perfect, thanks, Paul. And you've actually answered a subsequent question here from Wayne. He asked about clover scald, but I think you just nailed that then.
We don't have enough clover in our pastures here in Tassie to ever see it, except when they go onto the clover circles for finishing.
Right, well, thank you. Now so this is obviously a topic of interest, is a scald issue, because we've got another, not the same question, but Matthew suggested that they've got a major issue of scald, sweaty between the toes, but they have no lesions, abscesses, or foot rot, usually successfully treated with zinc sulfate. Any tips in prevention and other than preventative foot bathing? So
look, the short answer is that if there is no bacteria involved, so if it's entirely mechanical, or if the bacteria that are involved, and that includes the foot rot bacteria, are not all that virulent. So by virulent we mean they don't tend to go anywhere beyond the area between the toes. Then basically your two control methods are keeping them on dry paddocks, which of course is counterintuitive because the wet paddocks are going to have the best pastures, and then failing that, of course, is to footbath them on an as-needs basis. And the thing about the lesions that confine themselves between the toes, so these scalding type lesions, the thing about that, in fact, is that they respond absolutely magnificently to foot bathing. So, in the worst cases, it can, cause quite noticeable lameness across a high prevalence of sheep. But in reality, if you get on top of it quickly with a walk-through foot bath, you're going to control it pretty much regardless of the cause.
Perfect, thank you, Paul. Paul, a comment here from Ross. Ross asked a few of the earlier questions, and he said that breeding for sheep for moderate mature weight is helpful for reducing foot abscess. You have interest in genetics as well. Have you any comments on that, Paul?
Well, I think we should be breeding sheep for moderate mature weight, purely and simply to get the best out of our stocking rates. So, whether that will impact foot abscess, I really don't know. I guess my observation would be that it is the sort of absolute body condition. So, I mean, you can have a Southdown sheep that might be in body condition score 4 that weighs 50 kilograms, and then sort of a Texel that might be body condition score 3 and weigh 70. So, I think that the benefit of modest body weight relates to stocking rates rather than to foot abscess per se.
Rightio, thank you. Question here from Andrew. Andrew asks, Paul, would anti-inflammatory treatment help at all with foot abscess?
Isn't that a very good question? Look, generally speaking, I mean, it'd certainly make them feel better. And, you know, animals that are in the acute phase and you need to get them up and going quickly, it's probably worth considering. And now that's particularly the case since we do now have some registered products, anti-inflammatory products, that are pretty cost effective. The comment is that those anti-inflammatory products are not going to provide a cure per se. They're going to relieve some of the symptoms. So it's actually something that I meant to put in, and thank you, Andrew, for reminding me of it. But because we now have a pretty cost-effective anti-inflammatory, if you treat them early, it is going to be a good ancillary treatment to the antibiotics.
Great, thank you very much. Paul, question here, just for your reference, Paul. We have about 3 or 4 or 5 questions left here, so we're getting towards the end of them. Is there any advantage? This is Andrew, a different Andrew. Is there a difference, sorry, in the response to treatment or ability to eradicate various strains of foot rot? Benign versus, for example, benign foot rot versus virulent.
Yeah, yes. Look, we said that we won't talk about eradication because it's a whole can of worms. The short answer is that I never give short answers, do I? That's a silly idea. Look, the long and the short of it is that virulent strains, on the whole, are easier to eradicate than sort of intermediate and benign strains. And the reason, quite simply, is that the final stage of eradication, after you've got your prevalence down and you've done inspection, is that you cull the residually infected animals, and you have several inspections. And the reason that you have several inspections is that with a virulent strain, you expect those animals to manifest something in the time between the inspections. So it goes without saying that between the inspections you don't treat them with anything to suppress it as well. Okay, whereas with the intermediate and benign strains, they seem to be able to sort of just regress to a situation of quiescence or not being in any ways apparent, and under those situations you can't identify the residually infected animals. So it's not uncommon to go through an eradication program and get rid of the red hot strains and then still be left with these lowly pathogenic, lowly virulent strains, which are an ongoing source of irritation, not only because of all the hard work that you've put in, but because you don't, you're always second guessing whether it's a failed eradication campaign or whether you've just been left with a benign strain. And then the additional complication in New South Wales and Western Australia is that some of those strains that behave as benign/intermediate may be classified as virulent under their various classification schemes and methods that they use, but they are devilishly difficult, if not impossible, to eradicate.
Okay, thank you, Paul. That's no doubt a question that you need a fair bit of experience in the space to be able to answer thoroughly. Now, a question here from Andrew, another Andrew. Is there any advantage in making it a saturated solution so it allows for zinc being stripped out? Oh, so I think Andrew's asking, should you maybe have a more zinc than what you've indicated?
Yeah, you can give yourself a buffer. So I mean, given that most footbaths have got way more than 200 litres, then you can go you sort of one bag per 200 litres, plus another couple of bags depending on the size of it. But really, it does strip out, and it's also sort of carried out in organic matter, and there's all sorts of things that we can do about that to retrieve the zinc. But in reality, the simple, best and easiest way to do it is to go to the shop and buy yourself a dedicated hydrometer. Don't use your beer hydrometer because it's not calibrated to the same way. And then, you know, once you're getting down towards the 10 or 12% mark, add another couple of bags.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Now, a question here from Jim. Where can you source plastic foot baths which link together but don't have a central strengthening rib? I don't know.
If I know. Well, I'm going to guess that TP Jones here in Tasmania had something like that, so give him a bell.
No worries. Well, there you go, Jim. TP Jones and Tassie. Now Ross has put a qualifier in here for both of us that they did have foot rot about 15 years ago, but they've successfully eradicated, and they only get the occasional foot abscess now. So that's good stuff, Ross. Thank you for that context. Quick question here from Carol. I quite often have a lame ewe. She runs Dorpers, but cannot see anything wrong with the foot at all. What could that be?
Okay. Can be lots of things, but frequently those ones where there are no lesions, no pathology between the toes, so no scalding, no inflammation, no sort of Mankin disaster, and if there's no obvious swelling or tendency for the swelling of the whole foot, or one toe to sort of poke out, they're quite frequently toe abscesses. Now, that's a totally different disease to that sort of foot abscess that we've been talking about. And so they're the ones that if you just snip the point off the toe, you get a squirt of pus under high pressure, comes out, and the sheep goes away as happy as Larry.
Yeah, that's interesting. Right, well, thank you. There's something for you to take away, Carol, and next time you see one, you can determine whether that may be the issue. So that wraps up our questions for this evening, Paul. I suppose I've got one last one, if I may, just take the liberty. In my very, very short career in foot bathing animals, I noticed that the ones that I was doing, they were, in this instance, merinos, but they avoided the foot bath like the plague. They managed to be able to walk on the 2 centimetres of cement on either side of the foot bath. But is that because it actually does sting them when they put their feet in it? Like,
my word, yep.
And if that's the case, can you overdo the formula? Can you actually cause an issue if the formula is too hot and Yeah.
You've got a lot of latitude with zinc sulfate. So we talk about the different concentrations required if you add sodium lauryl sulfate or not. But there's certainly no value in having it more than 20% with the sodium lauryl sulfate, and 10 to 12% as a standalone. The one that you can overdo and cause quite significant damage, or substantial damage, I'm sorry, is formalin. So the stock standard recommendation for formalin is 5%, and you should not exceed that.
Okay, right, yeah. Well, that clears it up. Thank you.
You shouldn't be using formalin anyway, unless you sort of like inhaling the fumes.
No. This instance we were using zinc sulfate, so no, that's all good. Yeah. Awesome. Right, Paul. Well, that's it for the questions, and thank you very much for your contributions. It's been much appreciated on obviously behalf of us, the organisers of the webinar, and probably more so on behalf of the audience.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
My pleasure, and we look forward to hopefully hearing from you again at some stage in the future. So with that now, Paul, I might end the webinar.
Thanks very much.
My pleasure. Have a good evening. So thank you for all our attendees out there, and thank you from MLA for supporting the webinar series. Don't forget, next week we have Bruce Allworth delivering on whether or not we should be shearing our prime lambs for additional growth rate to see if they can finish quicker. Now, don't forget that you can actually watch these webinars on your smartphones. I suspect on your Android and your iPhones. So if you want to look up the GoToWebinar app, you can do that on your whatever, however you do that, and it might be an opportunity to see them on the fly. So keep that in mind. Thank you very much for leaving your comments in the survey results. And I'd like to thank you, on the behalf of all of us out here, thank MLA for taking the initiative to fund this webinar series and making it possible to get such great information out to a wider audience across Australia. So with that, have a very good evening. We look forward to speaking to you next week. Good night.